Hello everyone, I'm Zeenat Firdaus and I have Dr. Sukant Khurana with me. He's a well-known entrepreneur, mentor, scientist, public speaker, and an artist. Welcome, sir.
Thank you for having me here.
So this series is about art and technology. And in the previous video, we talked about what is the role of rhythm in painting. Yeah, so I'd like to know that what is divisionism and is it still relevant when tech is permeating art?
That's a loaded question, quite exciting. Let me first address what Divisionism is historically and how that's still relevant to producing interesting art. And not just the art that sits in gallery. Can we make for a beautiful world? Can we make Paris more beautiful? And can we make India cleaner? And can we make uh, the new China, emerging China, feel a very different place for innovation? Can we have America build back stronger with art being part of everyday life? Can we have offices better? So I think the question of how to sort of fundamentally think of technology and art is a bigger question than just painting, even though we are starting out the discussion from the perspective of painting, which I appreciate, right? Keeps it grounded on one thing, but how the world around us in some ways is painting, right? Your house is painted, your office is painted, your laptop looks like something. So painting cannot be seen independent of design, and those who demarcate between fine art and good design don't know either, right? So let's get to Divisionism in some ways. Divisionism, or as what it was also called luminarism, uh, was the characteristic style of neo-impressionistic paintings, right? Um, this was basically neo-impressionism was a term coined by French art critic Felix Fignon in 1886 to describe art movement founded by Georges Seurat, right? Uh, so pointillism and all, which moved away from impressionism because it wasn't just capturing impressionism in the flow of it, or it wasn't going in the Van Gogh direction of emotions. It was playing with the colors in a very attempted objective manner. Okay? So it was basically painting defined by separation of colors into individual dots or patches which interacted optically. So if you look at it as historical predecessor, the thing is that historically, you had even in Impressionism, people said, let's paint quickly. Some of the Impressionism was open air, plain air painting. So you weren't sitting in your studio having a beautiful lady or a gentleman model for you. You weren't just looking at a bowl of fruits to paint, or think of religious painting of Lord Jesus Christ or Archangel Gabriel or something like that. You are not even making an idyllic landscape, right? Which you observe and you come back and make it. The whole idea of Impressionism was to capture the feeling. And for doing that, the color mixing was done sometimes even in eyes, sometimes on the canvas, right? So you applied right from the pigment container, which was tube, which could be bottle, right? With various forms of carrying color, whether it's your oil paint or watercolor. Impressionism, a lot of impressionists use watercolor. Some people even started using ink, being inspired from Japanese culture and all. So there were various influences when the Impressionism started and the media they were using and things they were painting on, and some things which were a bit peripheral to the main impressionistic thirst. And like everything important, there were giant egos involved. People fought with each other, didn't put up stuff with each other. And in this conflict of personalities, there were also interesting things, and there were betrayals also. There were people, for example, Van Gogh considered some of the greatest successes, commercial successes of his time as sellout, who were his friends, and Van Gogh obviously was later proved to be considered to be in a different league altogether. And Van Gogh is also a product of Impressionism. He's not necessarily Impressionist in the true sense, Similarly, neo-impressionism is a product of impressionism as the next step, where explicitly you're having colors, dots or patches which interact in your eyes, not on the canvas, and you get this, right? So Divisionists believe that they were achieving maximum luminosity scientifically possible by doing it. Partly true, not entirely. Georges Seurat founded the style around 1884 as chromoluminarism, drawing from his understanding of scientific theories of three important people. Very important if you really are obsessed with understanding of what art has come to be even in modern times. Michael Eugene Chevreul was a French chemist, right? He was one of them. He was a genius in science, medicine, art. His work on animal fats led to soap and candles that we use today, right? The understanding of uh, margarine, stearocholic acids, versatile, right? Not a sterile academic professor. Mikhail Eugene Chevreul is the guy who's built modern world, right? He's one of the 1,000 people on whose shoulder modern world is sort of built. He had ideas of he had. I'm not saying they were correct entirely. They were correct for his time, and the ideas of how we process vision has changed. But there was this tall figure, and then you had Ogden Nicholas Rood, who's an American physicist, who's best known for his focus thing, unlike Chevreul, who's done so much. Ogden Nicholas Rood is more of a focus scientist, one thing, all his life. He's done few other things. It's not like he's done few dozen other things, but he's best known for his work in color theory. And then you have Charles Blanc, who is not a scientist by training, but he's one of the most influential French art critique of all time. So Seurat based his ideas on that, and pointillism was basically specifically the use of dots of paint that do not necessarily focus on the separation of color. So at some level, he was even criticized that some of these dots are not pure color; they're already pre-mixed. There's all sort of criticism around it, but with all the criticism, everyone would love to go to Art Institute of Chicago in Chicago, Illinois, and watch this beautiful Sunday afternoon on the island of La Grande Jatte. Right? It's one of the art's masterpieces. And I often joke, it's only a half joke, that critiques are like a dog going and peeing on a painting. They don't really make. So you can have all sorts of criticism, and then there are people who are making the world. Um, Divisionism developed uh, in 19th century painting as artists discovered scientific theories of vision, which encouraged departure from tenets of Impressionism. It's like a teenage kid rebelling against Impressionism, right? Um, there were theories of color contrast, which guided it. There was New Impressionism in contrast to Impressionism. Impressionism was characterized by use of instinct and intuition, while New Impressionism was driven by technique heavily. Um, so Divisionism was influenced by several other people also, not just artists, not just scientists I discussed. There was Charles Henry. He was a librarian editor, but very involved in writing of it. There was Charles Blanc, which we discussed, art critique. There is David Peer. Um, he's very important. David Sutter is there. Those who are into art theory obviously should not miss Michael Eugene Chevreul, who we discussed as this one of the geniuses, top 100 geniuses probably of all time. Ogden Root and Hermann von Helmholtz, right? He was German physicist and a physician, a doctor and a physicist, right? Who made one of the largest German associations, institutes. He's contributed so much to physiology, but he's contributed to understanding of vision and an art movement. So um, there is a long history, which I would try to sort of condense into a couple of lines. That you know, the famous work La Grande Jatte wasn't painted initially in Divisionist style. but the painting was reworked to finally give that thing. That has partly contributed to still ongoing criticism, controversies, right? Uh, but Charles Blanc book, Grammaire des Arts du Dessin, introduced Seurat to theories of color, right, and vision that inspired chromoluminism. But there were other people, right? Paul Signac was important in how they took things further. Um, so optical mixing was thought as producing more vibrant colors. Um, Mixing physically is a subtractive process where cyan, magenta, yellow become primary colors. In contrast, colored light is mixed together as an additive mixture. Do you understand? This is a very big difference. And why I think it's still relevant, even though you may think of the movement as dead, this still has, in this day of technology and art, not just technology influencing art, art influencing technology, influencing commerce, all of it even coming together to produce things which are the most worthy of human desire and even design of everyday use. Why these two particular aspects are very relevant. Right? The approach that divisionists took, and in fact, divisionism even inspired some of the self-portraits of Vincent van Gogh. So if you look at the self-portrait with felt hat of Van Gogh in 1888, that's heavily inspired by divisionism. So what is happening there? You're not doing the mixing on the canvas, right? The mixing is happening in your eyes, and because it's additive process, there is different vibrance to it. Okay, so there are some aspects of the divisionist color theory. They sort of use different contexts. Terminology is more relevant to people who are in the art history. There is local color, right? Local color reflects true color of subjects like grass is green and the sky is blue. There is this idea of direct sunlight, right? Sun's action, how they will be interspersed with natural colors to emulate the effect direct sunlight. There is shadow. If you look at some of the paintings, highly stylized paintings from Asia and Africa, at the same time, you don't see shadows, right? The vibrance of color is not there. The reflected light is there's another component. And one of the things which was great influence of Chevreul's theory was of simultaneous contrast, where contrasting colors could be mixed, right? And you would place two extremely contrasting colors in close proximity, right? Close spatial proximity. And one of the great things one can do, it's a crazy idea, that you take two paintings or three paintings, one after another, which are literally almost the same but colored differently, right? Which digital art readily allows. So instead of the spatial juxtaposition, a temporal juxtaposition for an image that blank flashes in front of you, which is literally instead of one image, multiple, can that produce an effect which is not seen before in eyes? Right? So there are crazy ideas which are possible. I thought of several such concepts and, as you know, been busy setting up companies running AI for drones, drug discovery, dealing with Indian academia came in, you can call it as a revolutionary, politically inclined, very heavily towards individualism, opposed to India's collectivization, was in US, not just studying science, studying politics, studying economics, and in addition to visual art, some of people have started to know that I've spent more time creating music, writing lyrics. There's been very less time to actually implement a lot of these ideas, which right now I'm trying to do. Even though whatever has been implemented is still few thousands of artwork, but the temporal idea hasn't been tried at all, right? The spatial proximity has been tried. The temporal one can give art a new angle. And this can even be done not just through digital art media, it can also be done through combination of some lenses and display, right? Physical art display that you move from one to another to another. And if you look at some object for a long time, it leaves a certain image. You can try looking at your screen or try looking at a bulb and close your eyes, the image it produces, right? So, what can three pieces of art, differently colored on the same spot, produce when you look at them, physically three pieces and move on, right? So, here's a big question for anyone who wants to think of the whole idea of color being formed in eye, which it is formed, right? And in the end, it's being formed in brain. I'll not give a long lecture on the neuroscience of color perception in eye itself. Eye is not just visual cortex, not just the V1 motor area of how things move, V2 and all, MTU and all, how things process in these, how things go in association areas of cortex. But even thalamus and even much below thalamus in retina, how complex processing is happening, right? So there's a whole neuroscience of it. There is psychology, there's a cultural context. We are all product of biology and culture, right? So not going to bore you on all those aspects, but there is a whole lot that this optical thing leaves. And I'll discuss briefly how the divisionism and influence, right, various people. So if you think of France and Northern Europe, they were people like Camille and Lucien Pissarro, both the Pissarros extremely famous, Albert Dubois Pillet, Charles Engrand, Maximilian Luce, Henry Edmund Cross, Hippolyte was there, right? Petitjean, Hippolyte Petitjean was very important. Additionally, um, Paul Signac's advocacy of divisionism and influence can be seen in some of the works of Vincent van Gogh, Henri Matisse, right? If you look at Matisse's work, some of them quite strikingly have this influence. You have Jean Metzinger, you have Robert Delaunay, and you have Pablo Picasso, right? One of the most celebrated painters of all time. Picasso's several works show, not the very late part, but several of the early to mid early works show huge influence, right? Um, but there were uh, conflicts of personalities also. There were other things. There were also things of Piet Mondrian, right? Jan Slutschers, Leo Gestel in Netherlands, who developed a similar mosaic like divisionist technique in around 1909. And then there were futurists, which were sort of in around 1909 to 1916, who adapted this style to reflect movement, right? Movement of things in a static image. So these influences have been there, and these have been influenced by some other very interesting people. Gino Severini's Parisian influence and showed impact not just in dynamic paintings but even in sculptures. So if you look at other aspects like Italy, there has been influence, right? There been this divisionistic approach um, had influence in the first triennial, 1891 in Milan. They were spearheaded by Grubisi di Dragon, right? They were codified later by Gaetano Prevati, right, in his Principe Scientifiche del Divinismo in 1906, very influential book in Italy. There is Pelizar uh, da Volpedo, who's applied these techniques to not just social subjects. In some ways, he was different because he applied them to very political subjects. And he was later joined by Morbelli and Longoni. So there was influence in Italy also. Not necessarily, I mean, these people are not as well celebrated somehow in US, right? Somehow they've not been the Italian masters of this divisionistic approach. Somehow they stayed in Italy, they influenced locally, and landscapes in Italy. You know, there was a flood of divisionistic influence of rhythm. So if you look at works of Giovanni Segantini, right, Gaetano Previati, Angelo Morbelli, Matteo Oliviero, right, there was huge influence. And then if you look at later um, influences, Plinio Normellini, Ubaldo Morello show quite strong influence. Giuseppe Comenetti, Camillo Innocenti, right? Enrico Leone's works, I mean, they just very obviously divisionistic. And Arturo Noki. Divisionism was also important influence, just like in US or in Northern Europe in Futurism. So if you look at work of futurists Gino Sovrini, right? Especially if you look at this painting well known across the world, Souvenirs de Voyage, 1911, right? Or Giacomo Balla, Arc Lamp, 1909, or if you think of Carlo Cara's Leaving the Scene, and that's Leaving the Scene is essentially like one of the signature pieces if you have to think of futurism. Or Umberto Boccioni, right? City Rises, 1910. So there are huge influences in Italy also. Italian influences have not been as prominent when we see it from US point of view. The reason I'm saying US point of view is I grew up, I was born in India, grew up, and then I spent most of my adult life in US until I had the mistake of coming to India, which I could have avoided, but sadly there it had huge personal tragedies, and realized that academia and research is not suitable. Even the top level, the leadership is obviously wanting to have huge changes, great changes, not just the current leadership, even the previous one, but the substrate sort of the middle layer is missing and hugely uh, deprived of soul, deprived of honesty. Um, in fact, you've got worse enemies than external enemies in this middle layer in India. But my influences have been primarily American. Right? So when I think of art, especially my years of exploration, so when I say that they're not as prominent, when I say that, I'm saying it from a perspective which is of a lens of somebody based in the US, right? Um, Surprisingly, when I look at it, India, other than stylistic influences, there hasn't been much more influence, right? But Divisionism was quite controversial. It got hugely positive attention. It also got hugely negative attention. And it was condemned for incorporation of scientific theories. And as a scientist and an artist, that's very interesting for me because most artists who didn't understand science, whether it was scientific or not, that doesn't really matter. The fact is it's scientific, they couldn't understand it and hence it was bad. Right? That's how 99.99% people work. They don't understand something, it's bad. They even start politicking, ganging up against it. It's human nature, right? We're not very far from chimpanzees. We are extremely violent, extremely petty species. So some of the reaction to Divisionism was extremely stupid, and some of it was stupid that they were criticizing for what it wasn't, right? So if you look at Joris Karl Huysman, right, who spoke negatively of Seurat painting, um, and he said, strip his figures of the colored fleece that cover them, and underneath there is nothing, no thought, no soul, nothing. I actually like the statement, even though I don't agree with it. At least there is genuine anger, right? Leaders of Impressionism, such as Monet and Renoir, refused to exhibit with Seurat. In fact, even Camille Pissarro, who initially was a supporter of Divisionism, later spoke negatively. It's like almost being a politician because once your gang starts disliking it, you also start disliking it, right? So um, there was a lack of critical, approval from the high art, so to say. That doesn't mean people didn't like it. Uh, there were some loyal people to the movement. Felix Fignon, right? Arsène Alexandre, Antoine de la Rochefoucauld. They remained very loyal to it. It also had huge scientific misconceptions, right? So they essentially misinterpreted optical theory and the understanding of even what you'll call optical theory now, right? Basically, in the sense of understanding of what is the wavelength 400 to 700 nanometers, right? What is the frequency, right? 750 to 420 terahertz. So, what impression it makes, understanding of it was missing. Most of the people who were actually painting weren't scientists, right? So these misconceptions can be seen in general belief, right? So there were general beliefs in divisionistic method were that this painting allowed for greater luminosity than previous techniques, right? Additive luminosity, which they really boasted about, is only applicable in case of colored light, not juxtaposition of pigments. In reality, luminosity of two pigments next to each other is just average of their individual luminosities once you view them from far away. If you're just seeing them as one. Now, there are nuances. The nuances are how far you see them from, right? Are you staring at the right close? Are you staying far away? So the effects that it produces are definitely different. Now, how different are they, and how obsessed you get by technique to miss the emotion, right? What's the purpose of it? And that leads us to some of the greatest conclusions you can draw from Divisionism in the current context, which is that technology can allow you to fundamentally detach yourself from the painful process making art. You can focus on your idea, you can focus on the soul of the work, or you can focus on the mind of the work, or you can focus on the heart of the work, while leaving a lot of that aspect of design in a painting or the implementation to technology. Now, that to several people will be extremely revulsive because they paint with their hands. And once the hand goes away, that to them is no longer painting. But you can define what you want to define. Art and technology are bound to merge. And who knows, to some extent, we are all wearing specs. They're already brain chips. There is idea of transhumanism, of uploading human brain. There are ideas of longevity to live for as long as possible, right? So technology is pervading, and given that I do a lot of work in artificial intelligence myself, often people joke, right? When is singularity happening, or when are you building Skynet? I said I'd just release it from my basement. But the idea is you can hate it or like it. It's very unlikely that you can stop the march of technology. You can probably do it locally, and then it'll happen somewhere else, right? Like in India, you have people, directors of institutes like ICER, CDRI, horrible people who have killed millions in the process of killing science. So you can stop growth locally, but changing growth globally is not possible, right? So it's impossible to change what will happen at the world level. It is possible to kill individuals. It's possible to kill locally things by short-sightedness. So technology and art are bound to merge. There is no question about it. And there are people who think that the more powerful will get even more powerful. And there is a genuine concern with technology and with art of have-nots losing out. And there are some people who are less, even more concerned not with what have-nots lose out, but that their bread and butter is tied to have-nots being have-nots. And I'm not just criticizing the left, also criticizing the collectivist right. And I'm also criticizing the extreme individualistic, irresponsible far right. Right? There is a responsible, innovative human freedom possible, and that, as you know, my art is not devoid of my political approaches to things. Um, and my art is very much against the petty identities, right? Which country you're from, which group you're from, is very against racial divisions, gender divisions, and all this. So I see this whole idea when I use the word divisionism as an interesting form to be taken up, the role to be taken up by technology, with a better understanding of optical theory, with a better understanding, current understanding of neuroscience, and far more importantly, with the implementation. And in this conversation with you, suggested a radical idea. What divisionism can do as a next step is instead of just the spatial division, can it focus on temporal division? And I think we will have some radical new art. We can revisit this whole art form of divisionism with the latest technology possible. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so this was very interesting answer, sir. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.